Hello everyone, in today's video we're going to be showing you transitioning between a piston-powered airplane and a jet. Now for those of you who saw the preceding video where we're dealing with piston to turboprop, some of this is going to be a little redundant, but there's a little bit of other pieces that kind of sneak in there, so let's go ahead and get started. So first things first, with piston-powered airplanes, we've got something that you don't have. Now if you're in a turboprop, of course, you'd also have one of these, and that is the presence of a propeller. One of the biggest shocks for a lot of people when they transition between the two is the sudden lack of vibration and the sudden lack of all that torque and P factor and stuff like that. That's going to make a really, really big difference. Another important thing to know about transitioning between piston planes and jets is, other than different engine instrumentation, is we tend to have different requirements, especially for our startup procedure. So this is a Beechcraft 36, which is a fantastic airplane, a lot of really, really good things on here. And it's single engine, kept very, very, very simple. And when we jump up to the jet, you'll see how things get a little more interesting very, very quickly. But one of the things you'll notice is climbing in here is how simple it is to basically get started. We basically can go ahead and fire up some batteries, get that all cooped up. We can go ahead and pop our mixture to the correct setting. We can go ahead and crack the throttle just a little bit. You wouldn't fly with a cracked throttle. We don't have throttle in a jet. And all we have to do to crank it is to basically just come on over here and crank it until that thing's all started up. Now, one of the things you're going to see, but we'll actually also see in a jet here, which I find very interesting, is the presence of our lovely little RPM gauge. Jets have RPM as well. The big difference between a jet RPM and our RPM is, rather than RPM, which basically is going to be telling us exactly the number, a jet RPM is going to be relative. It's going to tell us roughly what a percentage of our max RPM you'll be seeing. We also have a manifold pressure gauge. We don't measure vacuum on a jet engine. What we actually measure is the differential pressure between the front and the back of the engine, and we'll see that in a minute. The other thing we don't have on a jet, of course, is going to be cylinder head temperature, because we do care about the overall temperature of the engine. But for us, knowing what our gas temperature is between the two different parts of the jet engine is critical, as well as what our exhaust temperature is, because we don't want to be melting off backs of the plane there. Oil temperature and pressure will be the same. Believe it or not, if it moves, it's got to have oil. So we're actually going to see that as well in the jets. All these other components is going to be pretty straightforward as far as that goes. So another big difference we're going to be seeing too, let's go ahead and flip on the avionics here, other than things like having avionics in different places and having different controls for different components, is going to be the whole experience of getting the aircraft around on the ground. Now, typically when we're flying little piston-powered planes like that, we have two little lovely rudder pedals. And depending on your aircraft, of course, let's go ahead and kill the brakes there. Come on, let's go. Let's go. There we go. You can see by kicking around the pedals there, I'm actually steering that little front wheel. Now, on big jets, as you're going to see in a minute, that's not actually how you control the wheel. It would be a little absurd if you tried to take off and have to use a full rudder for the purposes of making a correction. It could go very, very, very poorly for you very quickly. So it's just kind of one of those things. So the other things we're going to be seeing that are going to be a little differently with jets especially is going to be the presence of our handles. When we took a look at turboprops, we actually had the same group of handles on a turboprop. They had the same shape and color, but they had subtle differences. On jets, as you're going to see, we don't have a lot of this minutia. They've actually simplified this significantly for us. What I'm going to demonstrate real quickly here is going to be one of the other really, really big differences. Now, during takeoff with a piston plane, what I'm going to do for demonstration is, remember, you can see our propeller spinning very distinctively in one direction. So I'm going to go ahead and apply full power. And now notice how quickly we can build up full power. That's it, full power. Now, what I want you to observe is I'm going to go ahead and kill the brake. I'm not going to press any pedals. Do you notice what our aircraft is doing? Yeah, it's trying to go that way. And the reason it's trying to do that is because of the incredible torque that this thing is actually producing right now, which is something that when we move over to the jet, you're not going to see. So we're going to get up to our rotate speed. We're going to go ahead and hit it. And one difference we're going to do right away is we're not going to touch the landing gear yet. Generally, with small single-engine piston planes, we want to leave the landing gear lever away until we know we've run out of runway to safely land the plane. That's just one of those things because of the length of time that it takes. And the other thing, too, is our actual snap off the landing gear speed is relatively high. So we're out of runway there, so I'm going to go ahead and smack up the handle right away, and then the thing's going to start collapsing. We'll go ahead and start bringing in our flaps right away. Now, here's going to be another major difference here. Now, if you notice really carefully, I'll show you with my mouse, this little knob right here, this says that our aircraft is actually flying askew. We're not flying straight, we're skidding. So what we have to do as a pilot as we climb, of course, is we have to push a little bit of right foot in order to center that. Now, if I put some real angle on this plane, now let's really make the P factor and torque notoriously bad here. I just need to slow down a little bit. Yep, now of course, in a real bonanza, my right foot would be to the floor at this point. You'll notice that I have to apply progressively more right rudder in order to compensate for that effect there. So we'll hold it right here at 80 knots. And again, you can probably see there on the floor, I've got a pretty substantial amount of rudder in there. Now, in the real world, of course, what feels like a lot of rudder is not a lot of rudder. It's always pressure-based in the real plane. You really don't look down and say, oh, 6 inches, that's correct for takeoff. It's just not like that. It has a feel is the best way to describe it. So what we have here is a pretty high angle of attack, and I can see my engines happily chunking along there. But a couple other things are happening other than me having to compensate for the torque of the aircraft. And that's the fact you probably observed my power is slowly coming down. So it says manifold inches and is at 26.6. It's dropping. Now, the other thing you notice is my RPM stays constant. Now, in a real Bonanza, we don't climb at 2,700 RPM unless it's an emergency. What we do instead is we actually come down to about 2,500. And a lot of times what we'll do, too, is we'll actually reduce our manifold pressure all the way down to 25 as well, again, to save wear and tear, and also if it's a hot summer day, which today is not actually. It's actually quite nice. We would want to, of course, reduce that to protect our engine, because that's just not what it does. Temperature-wise, you can see my engine cylinder temperature is pretty warm. You can see my oil temperature and pressure is fine. Everything else is looking pretty groovy there. And we basically continue doing our general climb here. Again, nothing too crazy. So now what we do, of course, is we get to our designated altitude. I gotta love this new turbulence they've created. Folks, on clear days, it doesn't get bumpy unless it's really high pressure. I'm sorry. That's just not how it works in the real world. All right, we're going to go ahead and tap that, and we're going to go pretend we're getting set up for a cruise here. So I'm going to go set altitude hold. Flight director is already turned on. So we're starting to level off, and of course, what we'd normally be doing here is we'd have to come in here. We'd have to dial in our manifold pressure correctly. We'll do 25 and 25 because 50. And let's see here. It's just a bizarre coincidence these numbers are remotely square. Cool. So then, of course, what we'd have to do is, we're setting it by power. We're not setting it by speed. That's a big difference. So what I would do now is I go ahead and start pulling back the mixture control. And in the real world, if this were not fuel injected, you just wait for it to go, blah, 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 and you're like, oh, that's it. And that would be more than enough to give us the clue that we found the sweet spot, so to speak. We pull this back. RPM will come down a little bit. And let's see if we can find this. Oh, too much. And it's going to be right about there. Not bad. Not bad. So that's going to be our sweet spot as far as mixture control goes. And that's just what we have to do. Now, what I want you to see here is the fact that I'm setting my power based on these numbers here. I'm not setting it for a specific speed. Can I set it for a specific speed? Sure. But I'm not doing that. And that's one of the differences we're going to see when we transition over to the jet especially. So the other thing we're going to do, of course, is now that that's all squared away, is we have to start worrying about what fuel tank we're using. Right now we're on the left tank. In a little while, half hour, we switch over to the right tank, back and forth. And that's all a very involved process. The other thing you'll notice is our nice patented turbulence here is giving us a nice little bump here, reminding us that we're only at 3,500 feet kind of thing. So hopefully you can take all those things in. Last thing we'll take a look at is watch what happens when I change my throttle quickly. Pull it back, push it forward. Pull it back, push it forward. Notice the response time. It's not instant, but it's basically instant as far as we're concerned. That's going to be a very big deal when we transition over to the jet because you're going to see that's going to have a substantial impact on our overall performance. Speaking of that jet, let's transition over there. And now things start to get a little interesting. For the purposes of jet, you were like, oh, you an F-16. That doesn't really demonstrate my point here. We're going to be taking a look at the Boeing 737 from PMDG. This is the Dash 700, which I like this one. I kind of like the 600 too. I'm like sort of torn, if that makes sense. So let's climb in, and you can see that things are a little different. For one, we have the kind of digital instruments, very similar. This is a very classic jet. Of course, there are single-engine jets. We jumped, of course, from a single-engine plane to a multi-engine, so that has its own kind of problems that kind of come with it. But it's not something that I want to get into. Instead, I want to focus us on the big differences. So let's go ahead and take a look. The first big difference here is the throttle quadrants. You'll notice the fact that we have two handles. Now, the reason we have two handles here is because of the fact that our jet here is naturally going to have one big power control lever on it. Now, we do have a mixture control, believe it or not, and that's what these two handles down here are. Basically, you can see our idle here, and you can see our cutoff here. This is our fuel control, depending on what we need it for. And there's no propeller RPM or anything like that. We just don't have things like that on board this particular jet. Instead, we just have one big old combined handle. Now, if I want to, of course, I can flip this thing up and I can do reverse if I need to, but I'm not going to play with any of those things. I just don't need to for this particular purpose, kind of a thing like that. So that's easy enough to go ahead and use. Now, one of the things that's so different about this also, other than having one combined handle for all this, is our instrumentation is a little different. One thing you're going to notice is we have this new gauge that says N1. This is actually going to be the RPM of our fan, which is basically the front of a jet engine kind of thing. We have exhaust gas temperature, which is going to be measuring how hot our gas is. Yep, that's the same. Fuel flow. Swinging down here, you're going to notice we have a couple other things. So we have N2, which is going to represent our basically high pressure section of our jet engine here, how fast that's turning. Remember, these two sections are not mechanically linked to each other. So that's going to be kind of an interesting little thing as they can actually move at different speeds to each other. Fuel flow, oil pressure, temperature, same. Notice we have a quantity, and we also have a vibration meter here. Now, we did not see a vibration meter on any of the aircraft that we've taken a look at so far. They do exist on turboprops, believe it or not. But one of the things you get because of a jet engine, because of the way it operates, is it's so smooth that you wouldn't notice necessarily that something's vibrating in a poor way. So let's go ahead and get this thing started. Again, that's kind of the initial differences here. We're going to put our throttle all the way back, and unlike a piston plane, we don't start with the fuel engaged. As a matter of fact, we have new problems we have to deal with a jet engine. Of course, now what we have to do is we have to actually engage a smaller engine called an APU. This is an auxiliary power unit. There are some turboprops that do have APUs on them, but generally most turboprops are going to be battery start. Now you're sitting here saying, what's the big deal? Why would you need to run a little mini engine? Because we need compressed air to start this engine. We can't just start it on our own. Now, those little PT6s we saw earlier, those things are, 300-400 pound engines. These things are like, 2,800 pound engines. It's a lot of mass we have to get moving. So let's go up here and get the rest of our switches kind of going here. Again, I'm not doing anything too fancy here. I just don't need to do it. Not for the purposes of this demonstration anyway. That's looking pretty good. The APU's booting up here, and we know that it's going to be working. Let's go ahead and shut off our two air conditioners. We just don't need it. Open up the bleed valve, and notice we have a separate system here for high pressure on our aircraft, which is basically going to be helping us out here. And the reason that we need this, and it's so critical, is because we need the pressure to come off that little mini engine to actually turn over our bigger engine. You can see we're getting a little dual bleed warning here. Of course, we get all fancy and shut all this off, but we don't need to. And you can actually watch as our pressure starts to climb there. So now that we actually have enough to start the engines directly on the pressure that we have at our disposal, kind of a thing. If we had, of course, air conditioning running or something like that, that wouldn't go so well for us. The other cool thing, too, is that little engine actually acts as a little power source for us as well. So we can actually sit here just sort of chugging away on that. Not all jets have this, but the vast majority of them will have that technology on board. So we can see we've got pressure, we've got some electricity, we're good to start. Starting is a little different. And again, if you saw the one on the turboprop, it's actually the same general philosophy. As our collision's going to come on, and what we're going to do is reach up to our starter, and we're going to click it to the ground start button. So what's going to happen now is our engine is going to slowly start turning up. Now, if we come down here, you'll see we have our little N2 monitor. It's come shooting up. And what we're going to do is we're going to come here. We're actually going to engage the actual fuel on this engine once we achieve a high enough RPM to actually start doing it. Otherwise, we're going to get a really nasty fire here. So that looks pretty good to me. I'm going to go ahead and click that on. So a bunch of things are going to happen at once. First of all, we're going to get combustion, which is going to show us a couple different things. You're going to see our gas temperature is going to start to climb. You're going to see our fuel flow is going to increase. You're going to see the RPM of the front, the big fan on the front. Let's go ahead and look at this on the front so you can see it, is going to gradually increase until it gets to an RPM where it can, basically produce enough thrust for us to get our party started. And we can also see, too, that little mini, the high pressure section is spooling up quickly. You can see our oil pressure and temperature comes up, and usually it sucks down a little tiny bit of oil. But again, we're not having too much issues with that. Now, notice that this thing is only rotating at about 20% of its maximum RPM. You can see the start valve closed itself off automatically there. And you can see at idle, our gas temperature is, over 400 degrees. It's pretty hot. The other thing you can observe, let me go ahead and float above my head here real fast, is the fact that that engine actually produces some pressure. So one of the interesting things here is if I actually were to push this throttle forward, I would actually see my duct pressure increase. So if you want to have a fun little game here, what I can actually do, is I could do something what they call a cross bleed start, where I basically use one engine to use pressure to start the other engine. So let's go ahead and reach over here real quickly. I'm going to go ahead and pop this one to the starting position as well. And we're basically going to repeat the procedure on the other side as well. So again, our engines are going to start boosting. Keep in mind at this point we're using one engine to basically help get the other engine turning faster. We can just keep an eye on our N2 right there. Just enjoying it, climb, about 25%, which is actually pretty fast when you think about how fast that thing is turning. But the incredible thing is, at 25%, the front of the engine is only moving at 2%. So just to give you an idea of how independent those two different spools are. So I've gone ahead and I've popped up the fuel handle there, and now you can see that fuel is starting to flow. You can see our gas temperatures are starting to stabilize here, and you can see the engine's basically spooling up on its own. And I can pull that other throttle and back it up a little bit, which would actually cause it to decelerate a little bit. But remember, we're still running off the APU here, so that thing's going to keep us happily moving here. And again, you can see we have two separate engines running at two different speeds. Pretty standard stuff as far as aircraft goes. You notice I'm getting a bunch of errors and things like that. So as you can see already mechanically, we've got everything just systematically is more complicated. Now, if you're in a military fighter jet, this is going to be a slightly different experience for you because you're going to have a lot of this automated, or you're only going to have one engine, for example. So it's going to simplify some of the system differences between what you have. And believe it or not, there are piston-powered planes that have very complicated systems, but you're not going to have stuff to this extent just because of the sheer amount of electricity, the sheer amount of thrust we need, and everything along those lines. So we're going to pop those off. We can actually flip our packs on real quickly. I can actually snap this to the auto position as far as the isolation goes. And I can actually shut off that little mini engine there because I don't need it anymore. Now, if I look outside of my aircraft, I can see all sorts of junk plugged into us right now. So this is more of a PMDG thing. But one of the things we can actually do is we can come down here. We could release this, and now we could release the wheel chocks as well. Basically saying, all right, guys, you can go ahead and I'll let go there. I can take care of it for now. So now that we have this aircraft started, keep in mind, I've completely bypassed all the navigational setup and everything like that. None of that I wanted to include because we're concentrating mostly on what's different. Not to say that there's things that aren't different, it's just to say it's going to be a little bit different for us. Let's see here, our two generators are operational. Everything looks good. Again, if the light is on, that means something's in the way that it needs to be. We're not going to worry about that there. Notice we have places to set our landing altitude, pressurization. But again, pressurization is not unique to a jet. So that's just what we have here. The other thing you'll observe, too, is because our aircraft is so large, we have separate fuel pumps. And if I actually flip on the one in the middle, you'll see it actually yells at me for low pressure because there is no fuel in the middle of the aircraft as it stands now. So one of the things I love about these aircraft is just how slow. I like how I'm just going to go smooshing right through this little GPU unit here. Just how slow everything responds. Now, you'll notice here that when I manipulate the throttle, we get this little white line here that tells me what I'm setting my throttle to. And you can see I back it up, I push it forward, it adjusts. But look at how slow the engine actually takes to actually catch up to it. That is one of those things that really, really surprises people when they first start transitioning over to jets, is how everything does not happen as quickly. Just remember how much inertia we're dealing with here. This is a very different scale of an airplane. So I'll go ahead and set that real quickly there and get that ready. Our altitude's already been pre-selected. Our flaps, we have separate hydraulic systems. Again, that's a scale of the plane sort of a problem here. That is not unique, like I said, to jets. Coming down here, of course, we'll head down to performance and one limit. Now, in this aircraft, we have the ability to set our power based on the maximum RPM, which is, of course, based on altitude. It's based on temperature. It's based on what power I want. Now, one of the cool things here is you'll actually notice that our maximum percentage RPM, finger quotes, is actually pretty high. You can see we can get all the way up to like 106% before it hits the red line there. But you'll notice right now, this little green notch right there is basically saying we should be using about 93% of our maximum RPM for the purposes of our takeoff here. Again, the reason being is because as the temperature gets colder, you have denser air, it's going to be performing differently. So as we kind of come sneaking over here to the runway, I'll kind of line this out real fast. I can actually change how much power I want to use, including doing what they call a bump takeoff, where basically I say, give me everything you got. And when I flip that, you'll notice my new peak RPM jumps to 98. I can even do what they call a derated takeoff, where you can see I'm at 91. Now, what an amazing difference in power that actually sets. Now, notice I need a separate computer to kind of do some of that for me. It's going to be tough for me to do those calculations on my own. So let's go ahead and get ourselves all nice and lined up on the runway here. And again, I'm kind of taking my time as far as this goes. That looks pretty good. Go ahead and hold down that brake. Now that I'm nice and established. And now we're ready for takeoff. And again, you can see this thing just wants to go, which is very realistic just because of the idle thrust that I have at my disposal here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to basically initiate a simple takeoff. Now, one of the cool things is I have a button here that says, let's see if I can hit the button here. And look at that. And now the aircraft, the throttles are working on their own here. Now, they do have piston airplanes that will have features like this. You will see this in a turboprop plane. But notice that that's basically automated for me. If I'm on an F-18, that won't do it for me. But notice it spooled right up to the RPM that it calculated to be the correct RPM for the particular situation that I'm setting myself up with. Get this thing rolling. Yeah, I didn't set up the FMS or anything. Again, that's not the point. I'm concentrating on our differences here. Get rolling pretty quick here. I'm going to go give it a gentle tug. It's probably going to holler at me because I missed about 10 different steps here. We're going to get up our landing gear immediately. The reason being is because of the fact we need to get this landing gear out of the way before we snap them off. Go ahead and you can see it got 3 red lights. Everything's in transition. I'm going to slowly come out. There we go. We'll go bring that out directly. And of course, watch this. I actually have to put the landing gear handle back in the middle. And The reason I have to do that procedure there is because basically you just run an hydraulic pump into itself. You don't need to do that, but again, depending on the generation of the aircraft, you have different components. Now notice our aircraft is built up a ton of speed here pretty much instantaneously. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to come over here. I'm going to activate my LNAV, which is basically my lateral navigation. I'm going to activate my Command A over here, and I can also have a bunch of other options here as far as altitude hold and stuff. I'm also going to activate my vertical navigation here. So this aircraft is basically completely under its own control based on the way this was programmed. There aren't really a lot of propeller-driven aircraft out there, piston-powered aircraft, let me be specific, that are going to have settings in here like what you see. Basically, you'll notice this is automatically chosen 250 knots because I'm under 10,000 feet. And you'll notice that my engines are basically running themselves as fast as they can for their particular level by their climb speed. Now notice right now, I actually have a couple different options. I can mechanically select what speed that I want. For example, if I wanted to trigger my continuous speed, I could actually get a little bit of boost of climb if I needed it. Of course, at any time, I could reach over here, grab the throttles, press the disengage button, and actually manually set it as well, which could be a very, very effective way to actually execute this itself. So let's skip all the way to the part where we're cruising. Here we go. We're just about to our cruise altitude of flight level 140. So what's going to happen here is on our regular piston plane, usually we'd set the power. We'd set 2,500 RPM, 25 inches of mercury. Hey, the Quabbin reservoir. But in this case, we're actually going to be setting it by speed. And now if we were a little bit higher, this is a very short flight, what we would do is we'd actually set it by Mach. We're actually going to set it by knots here. So one of the things you'll notice here is that we've selected a speed of 0.65 on the Mach, which works out to be pretty fast. Actually, you can see it's just shy of our red line speed here, and that's considered completely acceptable. So instead of sitting over here and grabbing the throttle and jamming it to the particular power setting, use 90% throttle. We don't do that. We can. In all the aircraft that did not have a lot of the functionality, that's basically how you do it. You set it to a specific power. Instead, what we're doing is we're navigating and cruising at a specific speed. And that's one of the big differences that you're going to see between the two different types of aircraft. Now, the last thing we're going to take a look at here was very, very similar to what we saw earlier. So I'm actually going to pop off auto throttle. It's going to yell at me. Of course, I appreciate that. So notice I can go ahead and move this. What I want you to observe is the speed the aircraft responds. Cut the throttle. Push the throttle. Cut the throttle. Push the throttle. Notice that delay. The delay is very substantial. But notice because we're such a big airplane, we have a pretty good amount of inertia here that we actually have the ability to take advantage of. So we can go ahead and let the throttle kind of do its own thing there. And I can actually just like that. And now it's going to set the throttle automatically. And again, that's unique to this jet. Not all jets have that capability. So hopefully you appreciate kind of seeing the big differences here. Obviously, landing a plane this size is not the same thing as landing a plane that size of the smaller Pistons ones. The important differences here come in starting, come in power control, come in how you set up the cruise, and that significant delay of power. Enjoy.